Hi, my name is Paul Robson, and this is another interview of Conversations on Fatherhood, this time with Father Michael Butler. He is one of those grand old men of the men's movement. He's been around all the way since the 60s and 70s and involved in Robert Bly and the Ethiopic men's movement and all of the developments that are happening out of there, and kind of followed from these kind of like the Jungian archetypes and the development through all of the years of what's been happening to today, where we have these online rituals. And he's then also a priest in the Orthodox Church, and so has some really great reflections on how all of that things have been kind of playing together. And we spoke about some of the concepts like spiritual fatherhood, spiritual brotherhood, and mentorship today, and the responsibilities that we have as leaders in the men's movement. And he also shared very generously about some of his background from Texas and getting up to Detroit, where he is today. And yeah, really great conversation that for me certainly gave a lot of excitement about the European Men's Gathering that's going to be coming, and what we're creating there in a kind of transatlantic relationship increasingly, as Maniphesto is kind of making more connections over across from the other side of the pond. So without further ado, here is the conversation with Father Michael Butler. So, Father Michael, welcome very much to this episode of Conversations on Fatherhood. It's really nice to have you on board.
Thank you. Pleased to be here. Glad to be of service.
Great. So we met on something called the Iron Council, which I imagine we might get into. You're an Orthodox priest. You've been involved in men's work for a very, very long time. I just spoke earlier to another guy who probably read Robert Bly before I was even born. And I guess you're in that same category as well, right?
I don't know how old you are, but yeah, I read Robert Bly's Iron John as soon as it came out. I was aware of the work that Bly was doing before he published the book. There were, in those days, this was, gosh, when was that? Mid-80s? I think there were just occasional magazine articles or alternative press interviews or things with Robert Bly in those days. And he was starting to have some men's gatherings. What was the origin of the men's movement, or the Mythopoeic men's movement, as they called it in those days. And yeah, you just couldn't find any information about this. Was days before internet too, so finding magazine articles required library searches and stuff like that. It was rough, but I was very interested in what was going on at the time. And while I never met Robert Bly in person and never made it to any of the Minnesota men's gatherings, which were a very big event in the 80s, I think into the early 90s, I had great respect for his work and where he started, and seemed a lot of the roots of what we still do today in men's work, they trace their roots back to what he did. And it was some foundational and some really groundbreaking work, and I'm very grateful for what he did.
Absolutely. Maybe you can say a little bit, what was from your perspective, what was happening in society back then at a kind of big level perspective, a high level, that kind of created the ground or the foundation for this men's movement, the Mythopoeic men's movement that you spoke about coming out?
Yeah, sort of the standard story that kind of gets repeated, and I think there's some truth to it. But sort of the standard story is that 20th century or late 19th century, early 20th century industrialization had largely taken fathers out of their children's lives, because instead of being raised on the farm and growing up with dad, or even if you had a small business, where Papa went downstairs to the shop and lived above the shop, with industrialization, fathers went away to work and were largely removed from the upbringing of their children. So upbringing became more of mama's work. The trades that dads handed down to their children, because their sons and daughters worked right there with them in the forge, in the field, in the brewery, wherever it was that they worked, was sort of broken. And so there became somewhat of an estrangement between fathers and their children. This was felt especially for boys, a kind of alienation. And so even as life and society got easier and more comfortable, a lot of the so-called manly skills, as it were, and the traits particularly that men have, greater physical strength than women do, courage and whatnot, were less in demand. And so I think there came a point where there really was a bit of a crisis of masculine identity. that started, after sort of the 60s and the hippie movement and the rise of feminism in particular began to call into question what role men played, personally and in society. And I remember way back when, I think it was in the 70s even, who was, I forget, one of the American magazines had the sexiest man of the year, and so they would all, you always wondered who was going to be this. I remember when it was Alan Alda who played on the television series MASH. He was sort of what in those days we called a snag, sensitive new age guy. I thought, what the hell is this? What has become of men? Okay, this is, women change their fashion, the length of their hair, the color of their clothes and all, but men have to change their entire personalities in order to, to sort of keep up with fashion somehow. And so there became a real question as to what it meant to be men. And I think a lot of men did feel kind of lost. I know I did. What was expected when sort of the traditional kind of macho stuff wasn't really in demand anymore. So where do you find your way? And sort of mishmash, homogenized, at least American society, sort of the whole melting pot sort of thing. Men started grasping, like a lot of people did. Well, what's my expression? Who am I? Where do I fit into all of this? What does it mean to be a man? And is there any place for that anymore? And a lot of different answers, began to come out. I remember very early in the men's movement in the 80s, a lot of the work tended to be focused on grief, which surprised me at the time, but there was huge amount of emphasis on grief and on wounds that men carry, because traditionally men, we just shut down. We are emotionally unavailable and tend not to pay any attention to our feelings. And that sort of thing. And so getting at no, men were really hurting. I remember the description, I think it was in fact Robert Bly's, where he said, we have all of these men coming, they're dragging their guts behind them, as they're walking down the way. He says, what do you do with guys who are carrying incredible amounts of pain? And there was no appropriate way to let it out that felt comfortable to men. And there was nothing sort of in the culture and society that really said that, men's feelings, as it were, just kind of mattered. And a lot of guys are just, uncomfortable just going out and sort of, emoting, broadly. And, I think even to this day, men are uncomfortable doing that, and with good reason, and with very good reason. I don't have a huge amount of sympathy for, we just need to sit together, emote, and, bring the towel and we'll all sit together and have a good cry, or, we'll all just get in touch with our pain and our feelings and all. There's occasionally a place for that, but most men don't really want to go there. And so that was not the main thrust of the early Mythopoeic men's movement. I think in those days there was a great deal of sitting in the woods and drumming. I've done that occasionally myself, I'm willing to confess, and it's incredibly good time and incredibly good fellowship as well. But what they were really looking at in those days were stories, and Robert Bly was a genius at that. And he gathered together with him other people like Michael Meade, who's very good with storytelling and all, picking up very ancient variations of stories, Grimm's fairy tales, very old things that have clearly appealed to people for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and look at how do these resonate? What is this saying to us? Where can we find ourselves in these kinds of stories? And just reading some of the descriptions of what they were doing 30 years ago with, just with storytelling as ways of sort of getting beyond rational cogitation about issues to a really emotional connection with characters and stories and all. I thought it was brilliant. And it worked. It worked to a great degree.
And was it connected to Carl Jung back then as well? And is it like the kind of Jordan Peterson, continuation of that? Or
yes, there was.
Jung was before, well, he was back in the 50s, 40s, 50s, right?
Jung was actually a disciple of Freud, so Jung was flourishing in the first half of the 20th century. But a lot of the stories did hinge on archetypes. And it's simply because, since they're common experiences and common ideas and behavior patterns for everyone around the world, men were able to glom onto them. So let's look at archetypes of the king. What is an archetype of a magician? What is a trickster? How do they play out? How does sort of, the polarity of young man and old man, play out? Senex, puer senex, things, and there are comparable ones for women as well. But one of the ones that Bly latched onto, and it's a very good leading question, by the way, was the wild man, the one who, who's not civilized. You have that again in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, if you're familiar with sort of dystopian literature. The wild man, Adam, in the biblical account in Genesis, sort of the hairy guy who was just still sort of outside, uncivilized, and just sort of doing his thing.
Yeah, and that's still today, I would say, like the bearing figure in, for example, the Mankind Project and some of the big men's movements that were really started there, I guess. But before we get a little bit too much into the theoretical or kind of academic aspects of it, I'd like to hear. So you're from Texas, I understand.
I am from Texas, yes.
We're in the 60s or something like that, I take it, and you're seeing this happening. Can you talk a little bit about your kind of entrance into, or your connection? What was it that you, brought you into this field and got you interested in it, and what did that journey look like?
Yeah, it's often said that all research involves me-search, and it was certainly that way for myself. I grew up in a small town in East Texas, near the Gulf Coast, near Galveston, if anyone is familiar with that part of the world. My dad worked for a chemical company there. He died in an industrial accident when I had just turned 8 years old. So that was the great trauma of my childhood. There are months around that time that I simply do not remember. And it was trying. My mother was 29. There was me, who was 8, my sister, who was 7. She was a widower. Mama remarried about 1.5 years later to the man who was my stepfather, whom I knew and was in my life for 49 years. He passed away just last year. It was not quite the same, and we were never that close. And so I in retrospect, I apparently was depressed as a child. I didn't know that, as a result, but looking back on things that happened, experiences that I had, I realized that in fact I'd been depressed, and that my mother had, taken me for treatment, and I, prescribed medications at the time to help alleviate that. It sort of worked. I slugged through childhood. My childhood was not particularly happy. I don't remember adolescence as particularly happy. When I was in high school, I sort of came out of my shell a bit. After Dad died, I gained a lot of weight. I was the fat kid in my class, chosen last for sports and PE, so I hated PE and any kind of exercise when I was young, because I was just not good at it, and I was very uncoordinated. And for me, it was just a continuous shameful experience every time it came up. That sort of resolved a bit in high school. I began to come out of my shell and developed a good circle of friends, mostly in the band, because I marched in the band. And it happened even more in college. So, I was okay. I was okay in college, and I went to a Catholic university that had a very, very broad liberal arts curriculum. In fact, it was so broad that it took 3 years to get through the core. And so I didn't really declare a major until my junior year, and I settled on psychology. And in those days, my department was in transition. The previous department chair, who was on his way out, was James Hillman, who was well known in self-help literature as a neo-Jungian, or an archetypal psychologist, excuse me. He's not a neo-Jungian, he's an archetypal psychologist. But there were a great many Jungians and Jung-influenced faculty in the psychology department. So I had quite a lot of that going on in my background and in my education. We were also moving towards it was a different model of psychology at the time, and they were hiring a number of people who were doing existential phenomenological psychology, which is a mouthful. Actually, one of your neighbors, there was a theorist over near Utrecht whom I met one time, Jan Heinrich Vandenberg, who wrote a number of books that was instrumental at the time. I won't tell you what he was writing about. This is more than half a lifetime ago for me, but we did that. So anyway, I went into psychology trying to figure myself out and why I was awkward, why large social gatherings, I could go into them for a few minutes and then suddenly everything would just shut down with a cold chill, and I had to get out and get away from people, where I was just, there was just some awkwardnesses there, and why I never dated much, in high school or in college. I thought, what's the matter with me? I don't want to go through my whole life a loser, and so I tried to figure some of this stuff out. And so the psychology did help, and I was interested particularly in, adolescent male development, rites of transition, life passages and all, and there was certainly a lot of that in the Jungians as well, rites of initiation, and that's what started my interest in it. I was looking to grow myself up to understand why I was as awkward as I was, and I think it helped. And so I continued to study that sort of independently. Then when Robert Bly's Mythopoeic Men's movement came out, then there began a series of books published. So began reading all of that sort of stuff. Eventually there was a Christian element to it, and I found John Eldredge's book, Wild at Heart, really to be very good. I attended Eldredge's Wild at Heart retreat in the mountains of Colorado, which was actually a transformative experience for me. It was really quite good. About the same time, I found there was a Catholic Franciscan writer by the name of Father Richard Rohr, who was out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who did, again, absolutely genius level work with ritual and symbolism and some embodiment and all. And he had a Rites of Passage, which he did in different places around the country. I attended one in upstate New York. Again, very transformative experience for me, and began to show me what could be done in men's work, just from doing it myself and being on the ground with other men who are doing what I thought was astonishingly insightful work. And from there, when I was ordained, there was clearly need in my own parish. Men were looking for a little more, and so we began getting together, talking, doing different things. I did use John Eldredge's materials. I've done some other things in my parish, and at the same time, I became the father of 2 sons, and I thought, God, I don't want my boys to go through the same shit I went through when I was growing up. I'd rather be a better father to them than my father and my stepfather had been to me. I'd rather they grow up better adjusted than I did, and not have to spend quite so much time, trying to get themselves right. So, it was not only for myself, but trying to be cognizant of what I was bringing to my sons. And I think we did okay. We're very close. We're very close now. And they're sort of, let me say, successful launch. They went out, they did okay, they're doing well, they're employed, they have girlfriends, one is engaged. So life is good. So we did okay. Good enough dad and good enough mother produce good enough kids, and it's okay.
Yeah, when you were talking earlier about how industrialization caused boys to be removed from their fathers, then I've had the experience just in the last month or so, actually, that my son has suddenly got really interested in everything about kind of like Photoshop, what do you call it, WordPress, media production, online tools and stuff like that. And it happens to be stuff that I've really dabbled in quite a bit. I've been using Photoshop and all that kind of stuff. So I've been able to actually involve him a little bit in some of my work. And that has been just mind-blowing how meaningful it is, actually.
Yeah.
While I'm teaching him concrete skills about how to navigate in the world and produce valuable products and offer service and stuff like that, I'm also spending time with him in just like, and we're negotiating values and ethical choices constantly in that work as well, about how we're working, how we're structuring our time together, what are the values that are important in our communication and things like that. And so
it's beautiful. God bless you. That is really beautiful. And it's also, as you say that, it reminds me sort of the one of the differences in the ways that men communicate versus the way women communicate. Women communicate, they face each other and they talk like this, which is, why I think eventually guys may get a little tired of, of sort of zooming, because they sit and always see his faces, talking at each other. But men typically stand shoulder to shoulder and we look at something else together. Whether it be the sports team on the field, or whether, like you and your son, it be the work at hand. But men very often stand shoulder and look at something else, and that becomes the basis for the interaction. Sort of the face-to-face stuff we do it, but there is another mode of communication which men are, I think, even better at. you know,
Yeah.
and the fact that you can do that with your son, I think will bear extraordinary fruit.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting what you're saying as well, because I mean, some people would say that it's a problem that men don't experience as much intimacy, personal intimacy in the same way that women do, because they don't have this facing each other conversations. And while I can certainly see, you know, and that's a part of what we do in men's work to a certain extent, I guess, when we often sit in a circle and we share the challenges that we're facing and we show our grief to each other. And then I also see some groups that just do that and it kind of collapses into this constant, you know, kind of feeling bath of that never moves on, right?
There's the danger in it.
Mm-hmm.
There's the danger in it because it just sort of circles round and round and round. Mm-hmm. Much better, like I say, is if it's focused towards something else. I heard someone refer, I forget who, some American sports figure who wears a baseball cap that has the letters ACE written on the underside of the visor, so he sees it all the time. ACE, action changes everything. Mm-hmm. And it does. And when you can get out of your head, it was always a problem for me being sort of, you know, very solipsistic, very introspective as a young man, and so concerned about how I would feel or what somebody else was going to think about what I did or said. And then I finally realized nobody gives a damn about you because they're all concerned for themselves. So just do what you want to do and you're probably fine. But when you get out of your own head and go and do something about it, this is much more effective for men. Mm-hmm. And I think there is a kind of intimacy because there's a how would I put it? Sort of the traditional phrase that men bear the burden of performance. So men are expected to do. Mm-hmm. And so when we can get together with another man in order to do something, there is a real sense of brotherhood there. I was talking to to a group of men a few days ago, and they referenced military service, especially combat. Mm-hmm. It says when you're together with another guy in a foxhole, it says that is a bonding experience unlike anything else you will ever encounter. And men who would otherwise have nothing in common mm-hmm. can become lifelong friends because of that experience. And so I think there are modes of male intimacy that do not look like women's modes of intimacy that are just as valuable. And again, you get a common task. Sort of the old images, you know, dad and son under the roof of the hood of the car, tinkering with the engine, and that sort of thing. They can be very, very close experiences.
Yeah, I'm kind of wanting to try and play a little bit devil's advocate here because you're over on that side of the Atlantic where it's the typical American man who's like just, you know, all action and no reflection, and I'm in the old world of Europe where there's like this very reflective understanding and things like that. And you know, I tend to agree with you. But maybe I can ask you, so we met on the Iron Council, which is this group of men who often share some, I think there's definitely some, an orientation towards action there, and which is clearly incredibly positive for the men in there, for the vast majority of them. And I've learned a lot from Ryan Mickler, who's the leader of the Iron Council, and you know, it's a great project in many ways. And then I have a Swedish friend who joined there, and he had an experience of first joining into one of these battle teams, which is the group where guys are working together. And he felt that, you know, there was a guy who had some things on his heart that he needed to share and needed to have witnessed or something like that. And the response from the rest of his team was very much, you know, well, what's your plan of action? What are you doing, kind of thing. And you know, like there wasn't any space for that reflectiveness. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about that? And how does one find that right balance between action and reflection?
I think they go hand in hand, really. And I also think that things like, or places like the Iron Council and the more intimate setting of the battle teams, which are limited to 15 men at a time on purpose, because there is a pretty much a maximum number of men you can hang with before conversation just breaks down or people just tend to want to sit on the sidelines and not engage. Theory and action, I think, very much go hand in hand. And I've known some men, maybe it's more of an American thing. a fellow priest of mine who's working in men's work in Orthodox circles in the United States says, yeah, you can have 45 seconds by the clock in which to bitch and moan. After that, shut up and let's get on to solve it. So he's willing, you get 3/4 of a minute. That's all he's willing to take. I'm sorry that your friend did not find quite so warm a welcome in his battle team for, or whoever it was that needed to share. It's not been my experience in mine. My experience in 2 separate battle teams has then been within about 3 weeks. And for those who don't know, we meet on video conference for 1 hour a week, every week. So after about 3 hours of interaction with these guys, I found that the level of intimacy that opens up, that men are willing to trust each other well enough, is really, really quite astonishing. And the fact there are things that I think men need to take to other men. There's a lot of stuff you don't need to dump on your woman. And she's really not there to carry your burdens. And it's very sexist nowadays to say, but we're the rocks. And our women lean on us, and it doesn't work if we're always leaning on them. It tends to raise their anxiety, and they tend to begin to think, oh, I've got an additional child here that I need to take care of, rather than the guy I need to go to support me and be my rock and my strength. So, there are things, there's a lot of stuff I think that where men suffer emotionally is that they do not have good male friends to whom they can take the kind of problems that they need to take there.
Yeah,
and so
I think I can definitely agree. I mean, and one of the things we realized is, I like your friends with the 45 seconds rule. What I've really found is that
I'd give you 3 minutes myself. But.
yeah. But the principle of having a time structure is incredibly important, because when we hold events, then we really give space for lots and lots of different things. And we have all kinds of different teachers that come and do all kinds of weird and wonderful experimentations at our events. And that can be very powerful, but it's really important for me. What I've noticed is that if there has to be a time limit, and if there's always someone who goes into some big emotional thing in a men's group, and it actually creates a lot of safety when we say, well, now the time's gone, this is the end of this point in program. And so, we're very happy to continue talking to you about this afterwards, if there's a need for it, but now we're going to move on to the next point in the program. And it's hard for me to explain exactly why. I can see why some people who are deeply traumatized, that could be difficult for them to go into. But I think if we make it clear beforehand that, we have a structure here and we follow that structure, then there's a place to put out all of our issues and problems or whatever. But then when the time is finished for that, then we move on. And it doesn't just become this, because actually the biggest problem I see today, there's been this loss of fatherhood, but I think, and we've spoken a little bit about this before, is the narcissism that comes from a culture that puts the individual so centralized, and everything becomes about me and what I'm doing. So maybe, I don't know, what is that?
Thoughts on structure. I would say, especially when you are getting together at a men's group or a conference or a retreat or something like that, because it is outside of the ordinary, what you basically have done is evoke sacred space. And inside of sacred space, it allows egos to be laid aside or to fall apart a bit. And that's why the need for structure is absolute. Because something external has got to hold people together so that they can loosen up inside and come to terms with issues that they're dealing with. So the stronger the boundaries that you're able to establish, the better off people are going to be in those circumstances. The simple fact that you've sort of gone off and created the space, that's why so much of that stuff comes out. It's the kind of stuff that does come out when you create spaces like that. But to deal with it in little ways, very often it's easy, especially when someone's beginning to share or beginning to emote or has touched something that's really very, very, very painful or something. You lance the wound. A lot of affect can come out, a lot of feelings, a lot of an emotion. And if you can channel that, it can be extremely productive. If it just simply goes and blows and makes noise, then nothing really transformative comes of it. So to keep it in good control, and then to follow up with men who have obviously, sometimes you do touch things that are very, very difficult, and where you can have a genuinely triggering incident where someone has touched deep trauma that needs additional help. It's good you have some way to manage that elsewhere, but good structure. And men respect structure. Men respect hierarchy. And when the lines are clear, where I know where my place is in the pecking order and what my job and my task is here, we're happy to function. Most guys are really happy as long as they know who they are, where they stand in the rank of things, and what's expected of them. They're happy to, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I'm curious about what you said about sacred space. It's not so often I get to talk to Orthodox priests who kind of have this kind of input. So yeah, can you say a little bit more? What do you mean by sacred space? What are the elements of that, and what actually happens? And can you see like similarities from what happens inside your church and other types of events?
Yeah, when I talk about sacred space, in this respect, I'm not going to talk about particularly religious or Orthodox sacred space. As I say, a sacred space is someplace that's outside of the ordinary flow of your workaday world. A therapist's office is a sacred space. You go apart. It's an enclosed space. You are there alone with the therapist. She sits in the chair. You sit on the couch. And you always have the same position. You want to mess with somebody, sometime go in and sit someplace else. If you're ever in therapy, go sit someplace other than where you always sit, and you will see how radically the atmosphere can change. So there's very high ritual content to this. But the purpose of sacred space is to provide a container in which our own ego structures can dissolve a little bit, or if they are dissolving, if we're in some life transition, we've encountered trauma, we've encountered pain or loss or something, and we need some help with that. We need someone who can help hold us together while we work through the issues. Sacred space always involves also a ritual elder, be it a priest, be it the therapist in the therapy room. It could be the sensei in the dojo. There are a lot of ways of configuring sacred space. But the purpose of the ritual elder is to hold you honest, is to keep the boundaries firm and tight so that you can do the work that you need to do in loosening up, and also to turn up the heat a little bit, if you're not doing the necessary work. If you wander off into bullshit, he's going to call you back onto task and he's going to hold your feet to the fire so that you do the work necessary to do. Otherwise, because come on, a lot of times, when we're dealing with really substantive issues, it gets damn scary. And we want to, you get too close to the problem, or that the pain's going to come up. What do you want to do? You shut it down, withdraw, back off. You got someone who's going to pull you back into there and make you stand in the fire and confront the issues is extraordinarily valuable. So we do the same thing in ritual space in Christian churches, at least those that have a liturgical tradition, and the same thing can happen, say, in other spaces. I think, even since you've referenced the Iron Council, I think the battle teams provide almost a kind of sacred space, with the battle team leader being sort of the ritual elder, as it were, because he's maintaining order and keeping the pace and keeping the schedule and the agenda going. So there are ways that it can be done. If you don't have good boundaries, if you don't have ritual elder who is controlling all of this, you don't get genuine sacred space. Sacred space is liminal because it's a boundary between ordinary and extraordinary. If you don't have good boundaries, or you get what you call liminoid space, this would be like a rock concert. A lot of people think big and loud and, way to go, man, this is really transformative. And all you do is really just blow off a bunch of psychic energy. You might feel real good after, a great concert where you go and you scream yourself hoarse, and have a swell time. But at the end of the day, what's changed? Well, a little catharsis, you're a little drunk, mildly hungover, but the next day you wake up and it's just all the same again. So nothing really happens there. So good sacred space requires solid boundaries, and it requires someone who knows what he's doing in order to help to regulate that for you.
It requires intention. Like that's the difference between a rock concert and for example, the European Men's Gathering, is that we can do very, very similar things even, but there's intention behind everything that it's aiming in a specific direction.
Okay. Yes.
At least that's one element. And I mean, what they have in common is a culture, right? So there's a culture that gets shared inside that space, and ways of being and ways of interacting. That
Yes.
kind of we become a part of something that's bigger than ourselves for a little bit. As you say, the ego structure dissolves inside of there. So I become a little bit more polymorphous with everybody else inside of there, and so I leave with a little bit of them inside in me.
Yeah.
And we've built something together, and we've probably also left something behind, or there's some things that
and in more individual things, like you say in a therapy session, what happens is we find out that life just isn't working for whatever reason. And so we sort of, whatever the structure is, I don't know, whatever metaphor you want to use, the structure of your soul is sort of loosened up and things aren't working the way you can go to a good therapist and he'll help hold you together so that you can allow that to fall apart again and then put itself back together. And what you find is that we sort of reconstellate ourselves in a healthier way that lasts for a while longer. And the few times that I've found a good therapist to use and go talk to it for a few times, that's kind of what happens. I say, okay, I got this particular issue, help me with this, and they do. And then when I leave, not only do I am myself, only more so. I don't know quite how else to put it. Somehow everything's tighter. It fits together better. I'm more cohesive, and life works, better than it had before I had gone. So you hope that's sort of the result. And I would expect that, a good European men's gathering where there was opportunity for men to share, really to open up, and maybe to lose some of the baggage that they've been dealing with, or work through some issues or whatever it is. When it's all wrapped back up, men go away not only, oh, it was a swell weekend, I'm glad I went, but genuinely healed, genuinely more integrated, and therefore able to live their lives better. So they're happier. Everybody they interact with, their families will be better because they are better men now. And everyone benefits.
Yeah, I am more self, only more so. I really like that. I think that makes sense. A good way of saying it. Yeah, you become more yourself by becoming more aligned instead of being more loosely tied around something that is unclear.
Yeah, and it will work for a while, and then until it doesn't.
Things unravel.
And then we have to go through it again. Yeah. But I've sort of in my own life and having heard confessions for a quarter of a century now, I'm sort of convinced that everybody goes through life transitions about every 3 to 7 years. And if you don't, you're probably not growing. They're maybe worth checking under the hood to see what's going on if you're not. But I found that as a constant pattern in people's lives. And it's a good thing. It's just normal. I think sort of we construct our lives in order to deal with reality as it is, and eventually it just doesn't work anymore. So it needs to loosen up, and we need to reconstellate in a healthier way. And so long as we're willing to do that, I think we'll be okay. Sort of the guys, we sort of make caricatures of the guys, who are in their 40s or 50s, already gray like me or going bald, and they're still riding around on their cycles trying to act like they're college kids. And it's just sad. It's just sad. They're stuck.
It does seem a little bit, and then there are many men who feel the need to do that. I certainly, as an adult man, have needed to go out and explore being a boy again in my life. And while I certainly can look back with embarrassment and pain at some of the things that I've done, I can see that what came out of that abyss of letting go is probably certainly more directed and knowledgeable and gain some life wisdom than what I had before. So one thing more I want to bring up, and this has been something that I've spoken to with a couple of guys on the Iron Council, which is that so there's quite a few guys there who come from a Christian background, and one of the things when I went from kind of I've been very engaged in men's work, and then some years ago I then joined a church. And I've now been in an Orthodox church, is that that kind of dedication to growth and to getting to the roots of myself is rare to find in almost all communities and amongst men. And there's a kind of a strength in men coming together in the way that they're doing the Iron Council, and we're doing at the European Men's Gathering and other places, which is incredibly rewarding and really helps men to grow past some of the things that are holding them back in their lives. And so personally, when I first came into a church, I expected, well, I'm just going to get all the men in the church to join me in this, and we're going to do men's groups in the church. And that didn't really happen. I have actually had the opportunity to do several men's groups in churches. That's been great, absolutely amazing. But out of a church of like 500 people, there'll probably be 15 guys that are willing to join and do it. They'll do it for like 6 months. And then some of them will be like, whoa, okay, now I need 2 years to integrate all of this. And so there hasn't been, I would say, a rush of that. And then I've also spoken to several men on the Iron Council who are in different kinds of churches, and also found that they haven't found that same kind of masculine fellowship and focus and dedication in their church community, which they really miss as well, because that's where they would prefer to do it, because they have a very similar set of values to the guys there, and I feel that would be the natural place to do it. So yeah, I'm wondering what are your thoughts about that? Why is it like that, and what?
Well, it's sort of my experience too. I think the internet and online men's fora and organizations has really provided. It's been an extraordinary gift. As I say, a lot of times men look for men's work or whatnot when they're in a life transition, when there's just a vague sense of unease, as things aren't working out. I could do better, or you hit midlife, and the phrase I like to use, you climb the ladder of success only to discover it's leaning against the wrong wall, and suddenly everything that you've worked for now, it's sometimes it's just dissatisfying. Other times it just turns to ashes in your mouth. Wonder, what the hell am I doing? Why, I've been, walking in these traces with this damned yoke around my neck, like a pack animal for the last 30 years. And what has it got me? I wanted to be a rock star when I was young, and that's the time that, you go and buy the Fender guitar and the little amp, and you sit in the basement and learn 3 chords and, practice your rock songs and all, which is beautiful. I think you need to do that. But a lot of times for men for whom life is going fairly well, don't need feel no need for the kind of introspection that you're talking about. So I think sometimes men's work tends to be more episodic. They come when they need it, and then they go away. And I think there's actually some precedent for that. There's kind of an archetypal precedent. You think of some popular movies that have sort of ritual elders in them. Lion King, for example. Rafiki the monkey, he's not central to the story. He lives off on his own. He comes in when he's needed, provides necessary wisdoms of initiation. He goes away. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is not a central figure in the story. He helps to guide it. He shows up when needed, gives what's needed, and he goes away. Yoda, at least in the original Star Wars movies, he was, epiphenomenal. He gave Luke what he needed, and then he was outside the page. Lived off in a swamp planet somewhere. They tend to be kind of isolated. So when they're needed, so when the student is ready, the teacher appears, like the old, Asian proverb has it, and I think it's true. So that's one of the issues with men's work. Secondly, I was raised Roman Catholic. I became Orthodox when I was 23. So that's the only churches I've had experience with. And from what I read and from what others have told me, particularly in the Protestant churches, there does seem to be some degree of feminization that's going on there. Okay, so I'm sure there are men in many of those churches who would dispute that. That's fine. It's it's like a secondhand observation, but some men are just not comfortable in those churches. I've my infrequent encounter with evangelical praise music and all lately has been, it's actually kind of turned my stomach. Forgive me.
Not into teenage rock concerts.
No, actually I had I'll tell you a brief story about it. I've had a few people come down with the COVID virus. Recently 4. And the last man was elderly and did not survive it. He was 90 years old and had pneumonia anyway, and he succumbed to coronavirus. So under present circumstances, I was able to do a brief funeral service at the funeral home with a few family members present. And a number of the family members were not Orthodox, but were evangelical Christians, his children, grandchildren, and all. And after I did the Orthodox service, they'd requested that a couple of songs, which the Protestants enjoyed, be played as part of the service. Oh, that's fine. So they played them. And one of them was all about, I'm sure it has a title, but it was all about, how will I feel when I meet Jesus? And, here in the afternoon, when I pass, how will I feel? And it wasn't about the encounter with the Lord. It was all about how my own feelings, will I feel this way, or will I be in awe, or will I be scared, or will I know what to say? Or it was like completely introspective and solipsistic. And I thought to myself, why the hell are they singing this? And why would anybody sing such a song? But I was,
fascination of me.
yes, my flabber was truly gasted at that. Didn't know quite what to make of it.
Yeah, there's a great article on the feminization of Christianity on the art of manliness. A very well researched, long article. I don't know if you've seen that, but I thought
I probably have it. It's been a while since I read it. Art of Manliness is a fabulous site. I highly recommend it. But there does seem to be, and I think part of it is that just sort of historically, women seem to attend church at a little more majority than men do. In some cases, it's almost 2-to-1. So if the congregation is 2-to-1 women to men, who is your audience? Who are you going to cater to? I didn't set out to find what many consider kind of one of the more macho, Christian groups to join when I became Orthodox. But that is a description. Some have said that we've been called the Marines of Christianity. That if you want, real kind of hardcore Christianity, you come to the Orthodox, because we still do all the ancient stuff in the ancient way, and guys love it. Guys really do love it. Men love it. They love it. I think they come. Forgive this. I'll repeat what we've said in conversations off of the video call. I've had a number of young 20-something, early 30-something men, coming to the church, and what they're looking for has largely been truth, unchanging truth. So they're tired of postmodernism and relativism. They're looking for structure, which we've talked a lot about. And I think men are really looking for structure today. They're looking for a church that's not going to denigrate their masculinity, and a place where they're not going to be blamed for all of the problems in the world, as they largely are in society. And probably also, an older man who gets it and understands where they're coming from and what they're doing. And it's astonishing. I had just 2 days ago, there was a young man whom I had in my last parish, my last assignment, which was like 6 years ago, called me up. Hadn't heard from him in 6 years. And he had sort of wandered away from the church for a while, and had started reading Stoicism very heavily. Good for him. And then someone had got him into reading Jordan Peterson. Good for him. And, sort of the genius for Jordan Peterson is that he's not a believer himself, but everything that he writes points to religious faith. And I think those who are inclined to it will see where Peterson is pointing and are willing to take the next step. So this young man called me after all these years and said, yeah, I think I just kind of need to reconnect. And we talked at, he's looking for meaning, for truth, for stability, for unchanging values, something bigger than himself to be a part of it, to believe it. He needed a cause. And we have that. So, okay, there's my plug for Orthodoxy this morning. I'll get off that particular soapbox.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, this balance between religion and kind of the deeper spiritual things, and then men's work, which is generally a business. And so that's been also a challenge for me, I would say. And I can certainly see beforehand, I've been very concerned about men's souls that come to me. And so there's also been an element of a savior gene or something like that, of me wanting to try and save people. And I think that's actually clouded my judgment to a large extent. And so for me, it's actually been incredibly good to start seeing Maniphesto and the work that I do here as my job. And my job is, to a greater degree, providing tools for them to reach the goals that they want to achieve, to be able to find truth together with each other, and very much orientated towards action, as you mentioned, right? Just like what are the actions that are needed to move my life onwards, instead of sitting and like digging up in all of my past and traumas and things like that. And when I've done that, then I actually believe that I am saving their souls to a far greater degree than by sitting and either telling them my own personal philosophies and religious understandings and helping them to reach God or something like that, which is, you know, what the New Age movement is all about, basically, is taking money from people and then trying to tell them what God is, and often giving them, you know, like telling, you know, putting all kinds of other, you know, esoteric experiences in there as well, or something.
Well, you have to get your money's worth, I suppose.
Yeah.
What you describe is if you'll allow, is a common mistake for those of us who are in positions of leadership, particularly ritual leadership, priesthood, or leading in men's work. And you need to be careful of sort of white knighting other men and this desire to fix and repair them. I know I got into
white knighting other men. What do you...
Yeah, white knight. You're the white knight. You're the knight, the good guy, the paladin on the white horse who rides in to save the day. All of that, which largely means sort of you taking responsibility for their lives, for stuff they should be taking responsibility for. You know, and yeah, you see people hurting, you see people in genuine pain who have totally mucked up their life somehow, and they're just a total mess. And you say, how can I fix this? Well, it's not our place to fix them. As you said correctly, to give them tools to fix themselves. But we can't fix them, and we cannot take that responsibility on ourselves. And, you know, as a priest and as a spiritual father, you know, my responsibility is to create the space, the sacred space, and to hold it tight, inside of which you can do your own work. And I can provide some insight, and I can provide a little bit of guidance, but at the end of the day, I have to bless you and send you on your way to do your own damn work, and not for me to do it for you, and not for me to spoon feed you everything, every step of the way. You know, you have to show a little bit of initiative and have a little skin in the game, which is, you know.
Well, I mean, now I'm going to dive into this conversation with theology, because so the Orthodox Church has this idea of spiritual fatherhood, right? Which is a radically different understanding of basically a man who takes full responsibility for those who are his spiritual children. And when I first came into the Orthodox Church, then I had a talk with the parish priest there, who's his name is Father Paul. He's an elderly man as well with a big beard, and he is a very straightforward talking man. You get the impression he's really investigated his own opinions very, very deep, and he knows what he stands for, and so he's able to share that. And so he's very much a father figure for a lot of people, and he creates that very clear structure and clear direction, which I think a lot of people appreciate. But his approach was very clear from the start, is that he doesn't encourage people to see him as a spiritual father, but more you should see him as a spiritual brother, which is, you know, that eye level conversations of doing things. So yeah, do you think that there's a role for the idea of spiritual fatherhood inside the Orthodox Church or outside the Orthodox Church? We're working with mentorship in Maniphesto core. What's the difference between that? How is a good mentor? How much responsibility does one take as a mentor? Or yeah.
Okay. Big bundle of questions.
Yeah.
My respects for Father Paul. I think he's saying things largely right. For a number of reasons. In the Orthodox Church, a lot of our Orthodox spirituality and a lot of our spiritual literature comes from monastics. And monastic literature is very deep, very profound, and extremely helpful, even for laymen living in the world. And I include myself as a layman because I am not a monk. I'm a married man. I have my wife at home, and as I've already mentioned, my kids. So I'm not a monk. And it takes a certain skill to take the ideas and concepts in monastic literature and apply it in a reasonable way to those of us who are living in the world. Genuine Orthodox spiritual fatherhood is usually understood as a spiritual elder, in Greek the Yeronda, in Russian the Starets, who is himself a monk and is directing the monks of his monastery or his disciples in the monastery. The obedience which a monk owes to his spiritual father or to his elder is not the obedience that a layman or laywoman or a parishioner owes to the parish priest. And that's sort of an important division there, an important guiding line.
Yeah, so
People
you would
call
actually say the parish priest is doing the same thing that I'm doing in Maniphesto in a
he's doing,
slightly different context, but he's also
yes,
just creating the framework, and then the
exactly.
tools are different in nature, but it's up for the parish members to grab these tools and implement them in their lives.
Exactly. Exactly. You anticipate me. That's exactly where I was going to go next.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, people come to me as spiritual father. They look for advice. How it is, you know, they're having moral quandaries. They're having difficulty living the faith. They want to increase their devotion or whatnot, and I suggest things. That's the most I can do is suggest. I can't order them to do this, that, or the other. You know, I have known priests who have abused that kind of authority, and it's a terrible thing to see. All I can do is encourage and bless them to do things, or say, is that really the best use of your time? Do you really want to go there? Have you thought that through? Or make some recommendations, and they're free to do with them what they want. And you're right, that is more, I think, also the role of a mentor. You know, you can make suggestions. You have only so much control, you know, only so much authority as they give you. Uh, but you can lead people, you can offer them things, but then the individual, the mentee, is responsible for either taking that advice or doing with it whatever he or she wants.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great deal more freedom there, and it's much more of an advisory capacity, a sharing, and there is a real exchange that goes on in these roles. I don't do much just sort of mentoring apart from being a spiritual father, but when someone comes to me and has an issue and is willing to open his or her heart and really speak honestly and frankly. I mean, when someone comes to you and opens up like that, you're either going to open up in return because the invitation for intimacy there and conversation and sharing, you know, is there, and it's beautiful, or you're going to shut down completely and run away because you're just not prepared for this kind of an encounter. So when people come, I find it very life-giving because it causes me to open up as well too. There's a degree of humanity, of openness, of honesty. You know, the masks come down, and you're dealing with people heart to heart, and this is a holy thing. This is a real holy thing when we speak, you know, as St. Paul says, cor ad cor loquit, or heart speaks unto heart. When we can get to that level, extraordinary things can happen. But you have to be very, very careful when you're dealing with somebody else's heart. It's very easy to bruise, very easy to lead astray, very easy to be too harsh or too quick or to be judgmental. You have to approach this with great care, great respect, and great forbearance. And when you can do that, then in the exchange, at least in a spiritual exchange, then we believe the Holy Spirit is there, provides a bit of insight, and you hope that what you say, you know, will be seasoned in what it is that the other person needs to hear. And somewhere out of the encounter, a way forward is found, or at least some comfort in a difficult situation, and they can go away somewhat or completely healed. They're better for it. You know, they can live another day, you know, from the encounter. I think likewise in the case of a mentor, you probably have something similar, though probably the scope of the encounter is circumscribed. You got someone you're working with business on. Okay, training. I'm trying to be an entrepreneur here. I'm trying to set up my business. How do I go? What do I need to do with this piece? What do I need to do with that piece? Well, I did this and this and this. Oh no, don't do that. You're going to get burned. You know, what have you. So I think the parameters are much tighter in a mentoring relationship, and probably limited, sort of like a therapy encounter. You know, you go to a therapist with a presenting problem, and that's what you typically work on. You know, it's very hard to go and say, my whole life is a dumpster fire, fix me. You'll never get anywhere if you approach it like that. If you go and say, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, you know, I'm losing intimacy with my wife, or we don't know how to talk anymore, or I'm concerned with, you know, with being a good dad to my kids. If you go with a specific issue, then you have something to work with. You can hit the ground running and make some progress. Okay. So I think, but you're right, the same sort of mentoring relationship as a spiritual father in a parish is, we're not talking the monastic spiritual fathers, the Gerondas and the Startsi. That is a completely different level of relationship and obedience. In those cases, those elders have you know, basically their word is law. and for, they're obedient. Monks are going to obey their abbots. That's simply it. And parish priests, mentors, leaders of men's organizations do not have that kind of authority. They do not have that kind of responsibility. And the last word on that, if you find someone who's out looking for disciples and wants that kind of authority, flee. Just flee, run away.
Yeah.
Because nobody who's genuine will be hanging out a shingle looking for disciples like that. If you encounter someone, if you encounter someone with wisdom, or it's got something that you want to do, or someone who's successful in business or your line of work, or fellow musician, or whatever it is, you can build a relationship that's mutually beneficial. God bless you, but be really careful, sort of, internet gurus, online elders and that sort of stuff.
I can speak from experience I wouldn't say I've taken the advice from or the orders from such a person, but I've definitely been involved in organizations that have had that tendency. So I want to bring things to a close and be respectful of your time. Maybe just a final question that I can put forward here. So the fatherhood was our theme.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we need fatherhood, and what's the greatest thing about it for you?
I do believe fathers are essential. I think biological fathers are necessary for their children, particularly when children reach a certain age. It's usually about 8 to 10 or 11, somewhere in there, when children begin to become a little more independent. I say the difference between men and women's ways of relating to the world. Everybody, men and women both, need to know different ways of interacting with others. And it seems that fathers come more into their own, or become more important in their children's lives as children begin to sense the need to separate and become more independent. So when, as we say in English, when we start cutting the apron strings, then fathers become a little more important. And if you can be there for and with your children, I think they grow up much healthier. In fact, fatherlessness is cited as one of the correlates for a lot of social and criminal activity, at least in America. Lack of fathers correlates very highly with poor academic performance in school, with criminality, with recidivism in criminality, with mental health issues, with poor impulse control, with a whole host of things. So socially, and I think the science is here to back us, fathers are essential in the lives of their children. Apart from even that, I think it may be, I heard this idea not long ago, and I think there's truth to it, that every man in some way is able to be and needs to be a father to someone else, that there is always a way in which we can be strong for even another man older than ourselves who's at the moment weak or hurting or something, that we can be a means of support, that we can be a means of guidance, that we can provide security, stability, strength, a word of truth. Sometimes that means, just sitting at the bar and having a couple of pints while someone else pours out his heart, and saying, I'm sorry you're going through this. I'm here for you. Anytime you need, you give me a call and I'm here for you. And there are ways. So I think fathers are important because there is a male way of nurturing and of lifting up other people, particularly other men, in the kind of ways that men understand, that's respectful of the fact that no man likes to appear weak or wounded. And there are ways that we can help that brother without shaming him for being weak or being wounded at the time, and can tend to the wound, in a clean, respectful way that does him good. So I think there's much to it in fatherhood, and like I said, it doesn't have to be. We've spoken of biological fatherhood. We've spoken of spiritual fatherhood as well, and I think there's just, if you want, a kind of psychological or cultural one, just really where, especially older men, can just be there for younger guys. I find now that my gray hairs have multiplied, it becomes a little more apparent, a little more easy for me to enter into that role. And I'm always deeply honored that when another man says, gee, can I have a few minutes of your time? I'd really just like to run something by you. And I realized, oh, there's more than just knowledge that's being transferred here, but there is a blessing. That's ultimately, there is a blessing which the Father provides that you don't get anywhere else. Kings do this in their courts when they bestow gifts or honors or, or titles to noblemen, to acknowledge and to recognize. Orthodox bishops do the same thing periodically. I think I'm up for some ecclesiastical honor this year because I've been 25 years in the trenches. So sooner or later, the bishop will come around and do me some honor in the middle of my congregation, and they'll all cheer, and I'll be mildly embarrassed by the situation. But ultimately, it's important, and for fathers to see what their children do, to be at their sporting events, to be at their concerts, to watch what they do. I think fathers seeing what their children, whether they be biological or the other children on your kid's soccer team or whatever it may be, there's a real blessing in seeing that, and blessing in being attentive to it and appreciative of it, that just causes children and younger people to just blossom. And that is why fathers are important.
I think that was a real treasure trove of information. So yeah, thank you very much. And that was a great discussion. The blessing of the Father.
It took me an hour to get there. This was rolling around the back of my head, but finally we found it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Father Michael. Very much appreciated with the time. And
absolutely,
we'll see you at the European Men's Gathering this year, I understand.
I hope so. Hope to be there. Yes.
Good. Okay. We're looking forward to it.
All right.
Good.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks.